Mix It with Mike. Plugin of the week comes from PSPaudioware. It's the PSP Datamix A567. This is a console that was built for the Record Plant Studios back in 1968. The 8 modules that are remaining are owned by somebody who has a connection, obviously, with PSP, and they came out with an emulation of it. So this console was really a famous console, I guess, because the studio itself was somewhat revolutionary for the time. Record Plant kind of went a little bit more of a kind of homey kind of vibe for a studio, being like more like recording in your living room, not hip hop homey, and which was kind of a bit of a departure from a lot of the more sterile recording studios. And this is a custom designed console that was sort of very unique. It has a very, very unique sound. Most famously, I believe there were only 2 that were ever built. One for Record Plant, and then two that were commissioned for Electric Lady Studios by Jimi Hendrix, who was recording in Record Plant at the time, like the console. Eddie Kramer obviously was a big part of putting this together. So he commissioned the console, but they never finished it. Actually went out of business, and so Electric Lady ended up taking over the assets of the company, or getting up all the parts and finishing the console themselves. So there's not a lot of these out there. And, this is actually a very unique emulation. And kind of when you dig into the console, it has a sound you may love or you may hate. And I guess that's what we're going to go through here. So let's kind of go through just like some of the basics of it. So essentially we have an EQ and an out switch. We have a preamp drive control, right? So you can give yourself more headroom. Apparently the original console, according to Eddie Kramer, did not have a lot of headroom. So you could drive it pretty well, but it has that kind of a cool saturation sound. Has an inductor-based EQ, which is kind of unique in that when you boost, it will give you a certain curve. When you attenuate, it will give you a different curve at different frequencies. So when PSP went about the process of doing it, they gave you the frequencies that are shown here, but then also added frequencies in between, and you can see the frequencies down here in blue. So they expanded the frequency range beyond what the preset settings are. So you don't see that, but there's some in-between steps in there. What's unique is that each of the frequencies have a different bell curve kind of shape. If you boost, if you attenuate, then some of the frequencies are a low shelf, and then it switches to being a low bell curve. So you have to kind of, follow along, and I'll show you a little bit about how that works. So that's with the low band. And with the mid band, you have a pure parametric EQ. Gives you like plus minus 16 dB of EQ on either end. Again, you got selectable frequencies from 3.8K down to 310 hertz. Right, so you got like a pretty good range there in the mid. Each one of these EQ sections has its own off switch, and I'll explain why that's important. And then you have a high frequency boost attenuation curve here. Now, there are a couple things that kind of go along with this. Again, I'll sort of show you the way this looks, because it's pretty odd, the filter shapes, and I'll explain that in a second with the plugin doctor, and kind of show you on display there what that's all about. But you have, so basically 3-band, low, mid, high. Output gain control. Now this goes through an output transformer, so you can get a little bit of extra saturation there by driving that or balancing the output. There are 2 switches here. There is the Alt Q. What this will do is it'll keep the Q bandwidth the same as you boost with the mid-range EQ. So each band or each frequency selection had a different Q width. This sort of keeps it all consistent. And then there's sharp, which just, there's a resonant shape, which you'll see to the high frequency boost, and this just sharpens that, makes it more pointed. So it basically, this is not obviously part of the original hardware. This is added in by PSP to give you some options. The one super cool thing that they did do is that they actually made it so that they gave you all 8 modules that they did. So they all end up being a little bit different. The boost attenuations end up being, vary. The frequencies end up varying. The Q ends up varying to slight degrees, which means that when you actually EQ a sound, you can kind of flip through some of the different settings and see if one just sort of sits a little better for no particular reason than just the randomness of it. And you can usually find something pretty quick. The moo setting over here on the far left basically is an average of all of these. So if you just sort of wanted to do it the old, like everyone the same kind of thing, that would be the average of all of these. Um, and then the number actually gives you the number sign, pound sign here, will give you the exact frequencies for each of them, so that there's no variation. One of the things that happens with almost all analog electronics is that the frequency that is put on the script on the console is actually it ends up always being off by some amount, sometimes by quite a bit. Sometimes it's a matter of getting like a solid number there, rounding it off to the closest number to make it look better. And sometimes it's just age of electronics, all kinds of other factors that can make the frequency off. There's also a variation setting. Now, what the variation setting will do is it will take whatever one of these selections that you've made, including the pound selection, and move it towards the average, or the moo, if you go to the left, and it will move it farther away from the average. So it gives you some variance. It gives you a variable on top of the variables between the different channels, so you could sort of exaggerate them. Now, if you do this left and right, what it does is it will shift the left and right in opposite directions. So if you go one way with it to move, it may move the right side farther away and the left side closer. This is just a way of kind of giving you a little bit of spread or separation between what would be the left and the right side. All right, so that's the basic setup here. Let's just do one quick thing here with the plugin doctor just to kind of show you what some of the variables are. So we could see a frequency selection or graph here. This is basically what I want to display here. Now, what's interesting that if I take the EQ out, this would be the normal curve, right? So this is 20 hertz. So there's a little bit of a roll off there and a little bit of a roll off in the top end starting at about 10K or so. If I put the EQ in, this is the actual shape of it. So you get a pretty major dip down here, like 4 dB, like around 500-600 hertz, like right in this range. And you could see that there's a loss of gain here. So, in net, if we probably raise this up like about 1.5 dB or 2 dB, we would probably have something that makes it sound the same level when you kind of bring it through. So it's a little bit interesting. But this curve can actually work really well for certain things, and it can sound really awful for other things. So you have to kind of experiment a little bit. I think anytime you're trying to kind of clear up and expand like the lows and the highs with a sort of mid dip, this is probably like a good choice. If you want a real like mid-range focus thing, then this starts to become a little bit of a problem in terms of the approach to it. But this is what the original is, so let's just start with it. What's interesting here is most of this occurs from the high frequency EQ. So if I turn off this band individually, that you could see that there's still a dip in there, but it's significantly less. And if I turn off the mid band, right, or the low band, that's what flattens it out. I think the mid band is the one that is the most transparent. So just putting this in just gives you that 500 hertz dip. Putting this in exaggerates it even more, and then you get this sort of resonant bump up at the top end, like, I don't know, what is that? It's somewhere around 8K or 7K or something like that. So sort of an interesting curve to kind of bring in to any EQ, or, just kind of bring it in. One other thing I wanted to show you, I'm sorry, just to kind of do this. Let me shut these off so we can kind of get to it a little bit here. All right, so here's our low frequency boost. You can see it's like a bell curve there, but wider, right? Bell curve there, but wider, so as you go lower in frequency. If I attenuate, it's a bell curve here, and then it switches to a shelving EQ for 60 and 30. And that just sort of follows through with the frequency selections that they make here. So on attenuation, it could be bell attenuation for the higher frequencies or shelving for the lower frequencies. And then if we take this out here, kind of do a little bit of boost here, you could see the resonant shape that's here. And if I hit the sharp, you could see how it narrows or focuses that you know, that sort of EQ. It basically just looks like it's just a bell curve, right? And so as we kind of go through, so there's no shelf here, right? And as we kind of go through, then it's a question of like, how do you want to shape it from there? So it gives you some options in terms of that it, I mean, in the end, you're going to kind of do it by ear. If I flip through some of these, you could see some of the frequency shifting that occurs. There's a lot, there's sort of a lot to this. And, you know, it's just to kind of get the variation of what's going on. So, all right, enough blabbing. Let's get on to just kind of hearing what it sounds like. So if I just start from the beginning here, I'm just going to start with, this is just the preamp. So what I've done is I've removed the EQ altogether, right? So there's no EQ out across the board all the way here, okay? Just so you can hear what the preamp sounds like. We'll do this real quick. And then we'll have one with the EQs in, just so you can see how much of it dips. Let's start with this.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived. They're building cars that drive themselves now, sending civilians into space.
So it just subtly, it adds like a nice little warmth and depth to the sound. Now what I'm going to include here is I'm going to include a trim here, so just to kind of balance out the level for this. So this will be with the EQ in, but no EQ, no boosts or attenuations on any of the circuits, just so you could hear what its static state with the EQ in sounds like.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived. They're building cars that drive themselves now, sending civilians into space. They got
right, so you could hear with that, what you're basically getting is a bit of a, you know, you're getting the you know, low and high frequency energy just exaggerated, the mid just sort of dipped out. That can work really well. It's just like kind of way of clearing out, you know, it's like a starting point for the sound. And then obviously you can still boost into that mid-range area to kind of drag out whatever it is that you need, attenuate the other frequencies, etc. Let's go through a little bit of this. Now, I went through and obviously did a demo here, and this has got EQ on everything from kick drum down through vocals. Let's listen to an A-B here just to see what it sounds like once you dig into it.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived. They're building cars that drive themselves now, sending civilians into space. They got experts on the TV and the radio, presenting the facts for one side of the case.
So obviously there's a little bit more gain there, but you could hear the openness of the sound, right? It does add like a really kind of pretty cool tone to it. Now, if I go through some of these things here, let's just kind of start with the vocal, because that might be the easiest one to just pick up here. Let me go to a bigger size here. So I am using, you know, the curve here, and I just wanted to show a couple of things. One is just the variation here, and, you know, go through some of the sounds basically. But let's start by focusing on this.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived. They're building cars that drive themselves now, sending civilians into space.
Right, so you get some variation of sound here with this. Again, the sharp kind of really narrowing that high frequency boost or that high frequency resonance. We can also kind of play around here with the different variations of the different modules. I ended up on 8. Let's see if there's one that sounds better.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived. They're building cars that drive themselves now, sending civilians into space. They got experts on the TV and the radio presenting.
So a couple that I liked here, maybe in place of 8, that's like 7 and 2. Let's see.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived.
Right, so just that subtle variation between the different channels can help to kind of create a little bit more variation, between things. I also put a little bit of saturation, which actually sounds kind of nice. It kind of gives like a little bit of warmth here to the voice. But here, let me just go A-B here. Let's drive it a little bit.
I see the headlines in the morning, and I don't know what to believe. These papers should come wrapped up with a warning for those of us who may be easily deceived. They're building cars that drive themselves now, sending civilians into space.
I'll stay where I was, but I kind of like, just that ability to sort of drive it a little bit and kind of soften the sound. It actually, Eddie mentions that it doesn't have a lot of headroom, and probably in the recording phase, maybe that comes out more where there's a lot more variation, with the dynamics of a performance to kind of dig out. One other thing I wanted to kind of at least cover here was some of the variation here. This can be very subtle, but let's just see. So I have the piano sound. So this varies between left and right. So it will push one side, either left or right, towards the average, and push the other side farther away from it. So it will sort of shift frequencies within the, even with the same frequency selections, what's happening is it's shifting the frequency slightly from one side to the other. In this case, I just kind of like it where it is. Maybe that variation in this particular case sounds to me like there's a lot of phase shifting that kind of goes on, and with every analog EQ, but particularly with this one, it's pretty crazy. So I think as you kind of go through it, on something like this, it kind of takes away a little bit of the naturalness away to my ear just on this. Let's see. Let's kind of go back here. The bass is another one where I drove saturation. And I'm not sure that's appropriate for this sound, but just driving that a little bit does add a little bit of something which I kind of like, you know. Um, yeah, I think that's kind of, it. There was one other thing maybe with the overheads here. Oh, this has got the toms in it. Just love the kind of openness. Like in this particular one, the symbols are kind of buried a little bit, but just to kind of kind of bring them out. But it has like a nice smooth kind of clarity that I really like. And you can drive into these. It will collapse when you push the game, particularly in the mid-range band. If you push, you'll start to hear it just start to get a little bit off sounding or like too aggressive sounding. But there's a pretty broad range of control, a lot of tonal variation, and it's something that you have to kind of feel out a bit. Does it kind of work with? And the more you use it, the more you kind of get a sense for what it can do, what it's good at, what settings work. Is it better to attenuate, or boost? You'll find yourself a lot as a starting point just turning off the high band just so that you can get more of a flat frequency response to begin with, and then kind of roll with it as you go along. You may find that you don't end up using the high frequency band at all, or end up almost by default sort of pushing in to the mid range to sort of flatten out or level out an area. It's a real character one, and sort of reminds me a bit of an era of recording where you rolled with what you had. And in that can often come a lot of creativity because the tools are so unique or have such a unique character that there's no way not to end up with something unique when you really start to dig into it and kind of learn how to operate it, kind of master it, if you will. All right, I'll leave it here. This is a really unique one, definitely worth checking out. Datamix console has a lot of historical value. And I have a feeling this is one that's going to be a real love-hate one. Some people will really love it. Some people will really hate it. But if you're just looking for something that's a very unique tool, this is definitely one to check out. Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week from PSP Audioware. It's the PSP Datamix A567.